name's Tim Malone, and I'm a history teacher. And today, we're going to examine the question of whether the American Revolution was truly revolutionary. Let me start off by saying that I answer that question with yes, it was revolutionary. Yes, the name for the event, the American Revolution, is correct, is apt. What's interesting is that there are those who think that it is not correct to call the event a revolution. In fact, 100 years ago, or even more, around 1900, there was a movement, I guess you could call it that, amongst historians to not call it the American Revolution, to change its name to the War for Independence or the Struggle for Independence, to emphasize the independence aspect of the event and not the revolution aspect of the event. Now, it should be noted that the Founding Fathers called it a revolution. That's what they called it. Their term for the event was the American Revolution. And then in the late 1890s and the early 1900s, there was this idea that no, it wasn't a revolution. It wasn't that revolutionary. Now, of course, back in that period of time, around 1900, historians at prestigious universities in the United States were rather conservative gentlemen, mostly gentlemen, and that period of time, revolutions were breaking out everywhere. And they weren't American-type revolutions, they were Marxist revolutions, they were communist revolutions. And these august gentlemen at Harvard, and Yale, and Princeton, the foremost American historians, didn't want to associate the founding of the United States with these more radical revolutions that were happening at that time. I think that's the reality of what this movement to rename this event was about. Now, this effort failed, and the term the American Revolution persists to this day and is generally accepted, although you'll still find arguments that the American Revolution wasn't really revolutionary, and it certainly wasn't that kind of revolution. Now again, let me point out that I think that the term is very appropriate for the American Revolution. The American Revolution deserves the name. Now let's start off with the definition of a revolution. And this is from Webster's dictionary. A revolution is a fundamental change in political organization or constitution which takes place in a relatively short period of time, the overthrow or renunciation of one government or ruler, and the substitution of another by the people. Whoa, that's very interesting dictionary definition. You know, one is a relatively short period of time, a revolution, and it involves government. A revolution overthrows a government and substitutes another government. And then here's the most amazing part of this definition: by the people. By the people. A revolution is a dramatic change in government instituted by the people. Whoa. Of course, it raises the question immediately, who are the people? Who are the people? Well, we'll come back to that question. Despite this relatively short definition from the dictionary, revolution is a very complex historical topic or concept. and which has led to much disagreement about which historical events deserve the name, as we just talked about the fact that there was controversy about whether the American Revolution deserved the name. What is a revolution? What events fall into that category? And it's an important category in history. Now, if we're going to examine the question of how revolutionary was the American Revolution, first, it should be generally noted that several of the most revolutionary aspects of the American Revolution have become so ubiquitous, that is, generally accepted, that they no longer appear revolutionary. In this sense, the American Revolution may have been one of the most successful revolutions ever, in that the revolutionary tenets in 1776, 1780, during the revolutionary period, have become commonly accepted around the world. They're not considered revolutionary concepts anymore. They're standard operating procedure, or at least they should be, or at least they're supposed to be. So the American Revolution loses a bit of its revolutionary edge because it was so successful. Now, first off, when we talk about the American Revolution has been described as a democratic revolution, a revolutionary development in the development of democracy. Democracy. Oh, here we go again. Just like in the previous episode, we talked about the utility of and yet the complexities of the term nationalism. Democracy is also a very nuanced and very deep and very complex historical concept, democracy. It's supposed to be what the United States is to this day, a democracy. And again, we're the first democracy. We started it. Rule by the people. Democracy. Rule by the people. And here we are again, we're back at the people. There was that book written some years ago about, who are the people, the concept of the people. And of course, the preamble to the United States Constitution, the writing of which is considered the final act of the American Revolutionary period in 1787, you know what the preamble says? We, the people of the United States. There's that idea again, the people. Who are the people? Well, certainly in 1787, it didn't include slaves, right? Did it include women? Who are the people? One of the key problems with the idea of democracy, of rule by the people, democracy. I have an entire lecture on democracy. And again, it's one of those global terms that's problematic and so complex historically that it can kind of get you off balance when you deep dive into the history of democracy. Because of course, the democracy that's established by the original Constitution in 1787 would not be considered a democracy today. The term has changed. I mean, no country that has chattel slavery, that disenfranchises women, that has property qualifications for voting, would be considered a democracy today, and yet the American Republic was the foundational, the first building block of democracy. And even though that democracy established back then wouldn't even be considered a democracy today, its establishment was revolutionary. At the time, it was revolutionary. And of course now, even the most obnoxious authoritarian regimes pretend to be democracies. North Korea holds elections. a pretend democracy. And so, in other words, the ideas conquered the world. So yeah, maybe when we talk about how revolutionary was the American Revolution, we got to talk about democracy, the introduction of this revolutionary concept. And there's still revolutions going on today, right? Or quasi-revolutions. Or if you just want to talk about the people in the streets, look at Belarus, right? In the last 6 months or so. You know, what do those people want, right? They want democracy. I'll also mention here that the American Revolution has been described as the revolt of the colonial assemblies. And what that means is that because of circumstances that, you know, we talked about in previous episodes, the 13 colonies of British North America all had functioning assemblies. It was called the General Court in Massachusetts and the House of Burgesses in Virginia. But they all had state legislatures that had real power, despite the fact that they're supposed to be colonies, right? And one of the reasons the American Revolution succeeded was because all 13 assemblies went rebel. All 13 assemblies went patriot, and we maintained that throughout the war. And again, as I said before, the British tried smartly to detach, you know, if they could have just got one colonial assembly to stay loyal or to turn back loyal. But no, all 13 stayed rebel. And those elected assemblies were the most democratic institutions in the world at the time. Now, what do I mean? Well, democracies are about elections. Democracies are about who can vote. And in other words, in all 13 of the colonies, in 1776, more citizens could vote for the members of that assembly, a higher percentage, than any other place in the world, including England, for Parliament in England. The colonial assemblies in the colonies were the most democratic institutions in the world. Now again, we have to say, in today's terms, they were not very democratic. Because why? Well, white men over 21 with a certain amount of property were allowed to vote. No government that had those kinds of restrictions would be considered a democracy today. But I guess you got to start somewhere. So the colonies were already the most democratic places in the world, and the American Revolution pushed that democratic trend further. By the end of the American Revolution, by the time the Constitution's adopted in 1787, even more citizens could vote. Every one of the colonies during the American Revolution, colonies, now states, every single one of them during that era expanded the franchise. Again, it was white men over 21 who owned a certain amount of property, but more of those were included. The trend was more voters, expand the franchise, and that's going to continue throughout American history. I mean, that's going to continue throughout American history, the expansion of the franchise. It's one of the implications of democracy, of having a democratic ethos, right, is expanding the number of people who can vote and doing away with limitations on the number of people who can vote. Now, along these lines, the ideology of the American Revolution is often described as republicanism, the governmental ideology, republicanism, that the new government established after our successful break with England was going to be a republic was a foregone conclusion. Our founding fathers were Republicans. That means they wanted to establish a republic. Now, 20 years ago or so, when I was in grad school, this idea of republicanism as the ideology of the American Revolution was hot. It was hot. You know, Bernard Bailyn and Woodward and these historians wrote books about examining the development of this idea that the ideal form of government is a republic, not a monarchy, not an empire, not a tyranny, a republic. And of course, the essence of republicanism is that sovereignty is in an elected assembly. An elected assembly, a council, a parliament, a congress, a house of burgesses, that the laws are made. Ultimate sovereignty in the government is in an elected group that rotates. Because democracy is about elections. Elections are what? The 3 F's of elections: free, fair, and frequent. Republicanism. Now again, because of the evolution of the colonial assemblies, the 13 colonies were probably the most republican places in the world, although England, Parliament had become supreme in England, right, 100 years before. But still, the colonial assemblies were, and the states were, republics. So that the new government was going to be republican was a foregone conclusion. And an examination of the development of all the way back to the Greeks, right? The Greeks had republics. If you examine that, what can we say about republicanism as an ideology? Well, first off, it's anti-monarchical and anti-aristocratic. And therefore, it's middle class. Now, we've talked about the middle class earlier when we talked about the Puritans and the Puritans' middle class ethos and middle class bias, right? In a republic, the middle class rules. The middle class. Wow, what a concept. And of course, the United States, as a general rule, from its founding, not, understandably, the way we're explaining it here, has always been described as a middle class nation to this day, right? We didn't have an aristocracy. In fact, our Constitution in 1787 outlawed aristocracies. There's a provision, I can't think of it, it's in the first article. Congress shall not be able to establish aristocracy. Titles of nobility are prohibited. Now, okay, this is 1787, and again, it's not just then, there's a long history in the colonies, especially in New England, of being anti-aristocratic, and all the English aristocrats during the colonial period would complain. They'd say, I went to Boston, and not a damn person there would doff their hat to me. Some count or some earl would visit the colonies, and they'd say, those Americans. The Puritan ethos is middle class. Well, when the Puritans took over England in 1642, they cut the head off the king, Charles I, or was it Charles II, and abolished the House of Lords. Now, both the monarchy and the House of Lords will come back after Cromwell, the Puritan dictator, dies in England, but that shows you the hostility towards aristocracy, towards monarchy. And when the new republic, the United States, outlaws aristocracies, that's revolutionary. That's revolutionary. Now, of course, blue-blooded aristocracies are pretty much out around the world today, everywhere. Oh, you still have the Queen of England, right? And the House of Lords in England, but they're more like pets, oh, nice little queen. But aristocracy, and there's reasons, modernity, industrial development, that aristocracies have gone out around the world, other than the legacies of the American Revolution. But in 1787, when the new republic outlaws aristocracies, that's revolutionary at the time. That's revolutionary. And when I say, yeah, we had a revolution, I should just stop right there, because I think that's a pretty profound development. And it's It's reflective of a middle class ethos. We're a middle class country. And the colonies, the middle class dominated. Middle class, what a concept, you know. And again, we'll talk about socioeconomic class in future episodes. But I think it's important when we're defending the revolution as revolutionary. Boy, start there, right? You know, start there. The abolition of aristocracy, very revolutionary. And here's another, you know, all of these are somewhat related to each other. Democracy, republicanism, and anti-aristocratic sentiment. And now we're going to talk about another revolutionary development, constitutionalism. Constitutionalism. Now again, in other words, that's the idea, the ideology, that your government, your legal basis of your nation should be based upon a written document that sets out the structure of your government, the parameters of your government, what your government can do and what your government can't do in a written document, a constitution. Now again, we talked about the fact that to certain people the American Revolution doesn't appear very revolutionary because the revolutionary aspects of it have become commonplace, have become generally accepted around the world, like anti-aristocracy. Well, here's another one. The idea that your government should be based on a written document, that's American. That's a result of our revolution. We're the first, I think, I don't know, in England, no, we're the first. And it's an idea that has conquered the world. Countries that have no intention of abiding by them have written constitutions. Every country now has England, right? England doesn't, to this day, have a written constitution. They have a traditional constitution. And that's funny because years ago, I remember when Tony Blair first ran for prime minister back in the 80s, you know, one of his planks on his platform was, elect me and I'm going to write a constitution for England. And then he got elected. Hell, he got elected 3 times or something, and he never wrote a constitution for England. Well, you know how politicians are. But, you know, but he was in a long tradition, right? He's like, hey, it's about time we had a written constitution because everybody has one. When the United States sat down and wrote a constitution and in effect said, this is the fundamental law of the land, this is how it should be done, that's revolutionary. And again, it's disappeared because it's a revolutionary idea that conquered the world. Yes, constitutionalism, a written document as the basis of your government. Here's another revolutionary aspect. We've already talked about this, right? The idea all men are created equal. The beginning of the rights revolution, if that's what you want to call it. Civil rights, human rights. The Bill of Rights was added to our Constitution first thing. We'll have an episode, on the Constitution and Bill of Rights. The vague ideas of freedom and liberty, the idea that every individual in the world has rights. To a certain degree, that starts with us. Not exactly. You know, England, Magna Carta, and England had, during the Glorious Revolution, had a sort of Bill of Rights. But the American Revolution plays a key role in the idea of human rights. And boy, is that still playing out around the world. Human rights, you know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And our Bill of Rights, you know, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, fair trials, you know, no torture, this whole bevy of things. And boy, you know, when the And let's remember, we'll talk about it when we get there, but the Bill of Rights on our federal Constitution has a history. The state constitutions that were written before the federal Constitution, after the break with England, almost all of them had bills of rights. The idea that a constitution should contain a bill of rights was sort of commonly accepted, and almost every state constitution written had bills of rights. It was in the air at that time. But our revolution kind of solidified it on paper. You're a human being. And again, you're saying, well, this is kind of hypocritical in a slave society. Yeah. But still, the idea of human rights was loosed on the world, or abetted by the American Revolution in its loosing on the world. And like when we put the Eighth Amendment in our Constitution, no cruel and unusual punishments, that's revolutionary at the time. That's revolutionary. And now, of course, even in obnoxious regimes that torture the hell out of people, they probably have provisions that say they shouldn't do it. I mean, that idea has conquered the world. So speaking of the importance, the revolutionary nature, the historical salience of the American Revolution, I have here a page from Time Life back in the year 2000, did a special edition, the 100 most important events of the millennium from 1000 to 2000. And since Time Life's a publishing outfit, it wouldn't surprise you that they put the invention of the printing press as the #1 most important event. And that's arguable. I'm down with that. That's probably. But here we have number 8. The number 8th most important event of the 1,000 years between 1000 and 2000, the American Revolution, right? A declaration to the world. And I absolutely, the American Revolution is one of the most important events in the history, in world history, for reasons that we've just been discussing. And let me now pause and say that some historians have argued that the American Revolution does not deserve the name of a revolution. And basically there's two main objections. One, the American Revolution was led by already powerful, rich, upper-class men who became even more powerful and rich as a result of the revolution. Well, and a lot of people would say, what the hell kind of revolution is that? Especially Marxist historians, right? What the hell kind of revolution is that? Led by the upper class. Secondly, critics say that slavery persisted through and beyond our revolution. What kind of revolution is that? Where the slaves aren't affected. Because again, it depends on what you mean by revolution. Marxists especially think the revolution has to involve the lower class. The lower class has to be involved. And the slaves, by definition, are the lowest of the low, and they're not involved. In fact, the slaves, to the degree that they were involved, backed the British because the British came up during the Revolution with various schemes that said to the slaves, flee to British lines and we'll free you. And some 8,000 slaves, not a very large percentage of the 600,000 slaves there were, but some 8,000 slaves did that. They fled to British lines, and some of them fought with the British. So what kind of revolution is that? However, I'm just mentioning this again. As you know, I think when taken in the terms of the day, the American Revolution was profoundly revolutionary. It's just that it's been so successful that its revolutionary aspects have become commonplace. So I want to thank everyone for watching this episode. I encourage you to watch previous episodes. And if you don't want to miss an episode, hit the subscribe button above, which allows us to create new content. Thanks to all of our current subscribers, and I'll see you next week.